The amber streetlights of North Main Avenue cast long shadows across the rain-slicked ass as 23-year-old Megan Moore stepped out of O'Malley's pub at 11:47 p.m. The autumn air carried the scent of wet leaves and distant coal remnants of Scranton's industrial past that still lingered in the October. Megan pulled her burgundy wool coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric darkening as droplets from the evening's intermittent drizzle settled on the fibers. She had spent the evening celebrating her promotion to assistant manager at Keystone Financial Services with her closest friends. The group had dwindled throughout the night. Sarah left at 9:30 to relieve the babysitter. Jessica departed with her boyfriend around 10:15, and finally, her roommate Claire had caught a ride with their mutual friend Kevin at 11:20. Megan had lingered, savoring one last conversation with Tommy Rodriguez, the bartender who had become a friend over the past year of Friday night visit. The parking lot behind O'Malley's was poorly lit, with only 2 functioning sodium vapor lamps casting pale yellow pools of light across the cracked concrete. Megan's silver Honda Civic sat in the far corner, positioned where she always parked it, away from the main flow of traffic, hoping to avoid the inevitable dings and scratches that came with weekend bar. As she approached her vehicle, her heels clicked against the wet pavement in a rhythm that would later haunt the dreams of those who knew her. At 11:52 p.m., according to her cell phone records, Megan dialed her apartment landline, intending to check for messages. The call lasted 14 seconds, just long enough for her answering machine to pick up, play her outgoing message. Investigators would later theorize she was simply confirming the machine was working, as she expected a call from her brother Michael, who was stationed with the Army in Germany and often called at odd hours due to the time difference. What happened in the next 8 minutes would remain a mystery for over 2 decades. The last confirmed sighting of Megan Moore alive came from Patricia Kowalski, a 58-year-old nurse finishing her shift at Mercy Hospital. Patricia was walking to her car, parked 3 spaces away from Megan's Civic, when she noticed a young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair fumbling with her keys near a silver. The timestamp on the hospital's security camera that captured Patricia's exit read 11:58 p.m. Patricia would later recall to investigators that she had considered offering help. She saw the woman drop her keys, but decided against approaching a stranger in a dark parking lot so late at night. At 12:17 a.m. on October 13, 2001, a passing Scranton Police Patrol Unit conducted a routine sweep of the O'Malley's parking lot. Officer Daniel Kowalczyk noted in his report that the lot was empty except for a silver Honda Civic with Pennsylvania plates. The officer assumed the owner was still inside the establishment and continued his patrol. When O'Malley's closed at 2 a.m., owner Sean O'Malley discovered the car still in his lot. Following standard protocol for abandoned vehicle, he waited until the next evening before calling for tow. By Sunday morning, October 14th, Megan's roommate Claire Brennan was frantic. Megan had not returned home Friday night, had not answered her cell phone all weekend, and had failed to show up for her Saturday morning shift at the bank, something completely out of character for the methodical young woman who had never missed a day of work since starting at Keystone Financial 18 months earlier. The Scranton Police Department's initial response was measured and by the book. Missing persons cases involving adults typically required a 48-hour waiting period unless there were signs of foul play or the individual was considered particularly vulnerable. Detective Sergeant Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran of the force, was assigned to the case Monday morning. Santos had seen enough missing person cases to know that most young adults who disappeared over weekends usually turned up within a few days, often embarrassed and sometimes nursing hangovers and bearing stories spontaneous. But Megan Moore was different, and Detective Santos recognized within hours of beginning. The missing woman's bank accounts showed no activity at 11:30 p.m. Friday when she had purchased her last drink at O'Malley. Her credit cards remained unused. Her cell phone had been turned off, disabled sometime between 11:52 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. Saturday. The window narrowed by failed call attempts from concerned friends. Most telling of all, Megan had been scheduled to take her younger sister Kate college shopping on Saturday morning, a commitment she had been discussing excitedly for weeks. The Honda Civic told a more disturbing story. When detectives processed the vehicle on Monday afternoon, they found Megan's purse on the front passenger seat, containing her wallet with $100 in cash, all her credit cards, and her driver's. Her cell phone was discovered under the driver's seat, its battery dead. The car keys were found on the ground beside the driver's door, scattered as if they had been dropped suddenly. A small scuff mark on the concrete nearby suggested they might have been kicked accidentally in some kind of struggle or hurried movement. More concerning was what investigators found inside the vehicle. Megan's car was unusually clean, too clean, according to forensics specialist Janet Walsh. The interior showed signs of recent detailed cleaning with commercial-grade products, far beyond what was expected for regular maintenance. The chemical scent of industrial cleaners lingered, despite the car having sat in the lot 3 days. Fiber analysis would later reveal traces of cleaning compounds typically used by professional crime scene cleanup crews, not the consumer products found in most auto detailing shops. The physical evidence painted a picture of careful, methodical planning rather than a crime of opportunity. Whoever had taken Megan Moore had done so with preparation and forethought. They had access to professional cleaning supplies and the knowledge to use them. Most disturbing of all, they had been confident enough to leave the car in plain sight rather than attempting to destroy it. Detective Santos initiated a comprehensive canvass of the neighborhood surrounding O'Malley's, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen something suspicious in the crucial window between 11:58 p.m. and 12:17 a.m. The area was a mix of small businesses, aging apartment buildings, and single-family homes that had seen better days. Most residents kept to themselves, especially late on Friday nights when the bar crowd could be unpredictable. The detective's canvass yielded frustratingly little useful information. Mrs. Elena Petrosky, who lived in the apartment building directly across from O'Malley's, reported hearing a car door slam around midnight, followed by the sound of a vehicle driving away quickly. However, she had not looked out her window and could provide no vehicle or its. 2 doors down, college student Marcus Webb thought he had heard a woman's voice call out sometime before midnight, but he had been playing video games with headphones on and couldn't be certain of the timing or content. The most promising lead came from an unexpected source. At 3:30 a.m. on October 13th, roughly 3.5 hours after Megan's disappearance, the Pennsylvania Turnpike's automated toll collection system recorded a transaction at Pocono exit, approximately 45 miles northeast of Scranton. The vehicle was a dark-colored SUV with Pennsylvania plates, and the transaction was paid with cash rather than EasyPass. While this might have been a coincidence, the timing and direction caught Detective Santos's attention. The Pocono Mountains region, sparsely populated, heavily forested, and contained numerous abandoned mining sites and quarries, perfect locations for concealing evidence. Unfortunately, the toll plaza's security cameras from that night had malfunctioned due to a power surge earlier in the evening, leaving investigators without visual confirmation of the vehicle or its occupant. The toll booth attendant, a part-time college student named Ryan Murphy, remembered the transaction only because the driver had seemed nervous and had fumbled with the cash. Murphy described the driver as a middle-aged white male wearing a baseball cap, but the brief interaction, dim lighting, made a more detailed description impossible. As the first week of the investigation drew to a close, Detective Santos found herself with more questions than answers. Megan Moore had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only scattered keys, a too-clean car, and a handful of cryptic clues that pointed toward something far more sinister than a typical missing person. The methodical nature of the evidence tampering suggested involvement by someone with experience in criminal activity, possibly law enforcement or military background. What Detective Santos couldn't have known at the time was that Megan Moore's disappearance was not an isolated, hidden in the files of police departments across Pennsylvania and neighboring states were similar cases. Young women who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their vehicles found abandoned and suspiciously clean, their personal belongings behind as if to taunt investigators. The pattern would only become clear years later, when advances in database technology and interagency communication would reveal the scope of what had been dismissed as unconnected tragedy. On the evening of October 19, 2001, exactly 1 week after Megan Moore had walked out of O'Malley's pub for the last time, Detective Santos stood in the empty parking lot where it all began. The autumn wind carried the same sense of wet leaves and distant coal smoke, but but now they seemed heavy with menace nostalgia. She stared at the spot where Megan's keys had been found, trying to imagine what terror had unfolded in those crucial 8 minutes. Unknown to Detective Santos, she was being watched. From the shadow of a building across the street, a figure observed her every movement, taking note of how thoroughly she examined the scene, how carefully she documented every detail. The watcher smiled grimly, confident that the careful planning and professional execution of Megan Moore's abduction would never be unraveled. After all, they had done this before, and they would do it again. The game had only just begun. The weeks following Megan Moore's disappearance transformed the tight-knit community of North Scranton into a pressure cooker of suspicion and fear. Detective Santos found herself working 18-hour days, chasing leads that seemed to evaporate like morning mist the moment the case had garnered significant media attention, particularly after the Times-Tribune ran a front-page story about the vanishing of Scranton's sweetheart, a reference to Megan's volunteer work at the local children's hospital and her reputation as someone who went out of her way to the Moore family's anguish palpable during every interaction with law enforcement. Robert Moore, Megan's father and a respected foreman at the last remaining coal processing plant in the area, had aged visibly in the month since his daughter's disappearance. His wife, Janet, a part-time librarian at the University of Scranton, oscillated between periods of frantic activity, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, and deep depression that left her unable to leave the house for days at a time. Detective Santos's investigation had expanded to include a multi-agency task force coordinated through the Pennsylvania State Police. FBI involvement had been requested after the discovery of potential interstate elements, specifically the Pocono Turnpike toll transaction and the possibility that Megan had transported across state lines. Special Agent Marcus Reed, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's Violent Crimes Against Children Unit, brought federal resources and a grim expertise in abduction cases. The first major break came in November 2001, when forensic analysis of Megan's Honda Civic revealed microscopic traces of an unusual industrial solvent called methylene chloride in the vehicle's carpet fibers. This chemical was primarily used in paint stripping operations and was not commonly available to civilians. The discovery narrowed the suspect pool to individuals with access to commercial painting or automotive refinishing operation, military facilities, or certain types of manufacturing plants. Agent Reed's team cross-referenced businesses in a 100-mile radius, Scranton, that used methylene chloride in their operation. The list was surprisingly long. 347 registered businesses ranging from large automotive plants to small body shops. However, when filtered for operations that worked night shift or had minimal security oversight, the number dropped to 43 potential locations of interest. Detective Santos and Agent Reed began the methodical process of visiting each interview with manager employees and examining work schedules the night of October 12th. The work was tedious and often frustrating, as many business owners were reluctant to provide employee information without court orders, and several smaller operations had incomplete, poorly maintained record. Their persistence paid off on December 8, 2001, when they visited Precision Auto Body, a small shop on the outskirts of Scranton's industry. The owner, Vincent Carpelli, had initially been cooperative, providing work schedules and employee lists without resistance. However, when Agent Reed asked to examine the shop's security camera footage from October, Carpelli became evasive, claiming that the recording system had been acting up for months and that older footage had been automatically overwritten. A background check on Precision Auto Body revealed several red flags. The business had been cited multiple times for improper disposal of hazardous chemicals, and Vincent Carpelli had 2 previous arrests for receiving stolen vehicles, though charges had been dropped both times due to insufficient evidence. More intriguingly, the shop's insurance showed an unusual number of break-ins and equipment 3 years, a pattern that suggested either incredible bad luck or deliberate insurance. When Detective Santos returned to Precision Auto Body with a search warrant on December 15th, she found the business closed with a handwritten sign claiming temporary closure for equipment maintenance. Neighbors reported that a large truck arrived that evening and removed several pieces of machinery and multiple barrels of what appeared to be chemical waste. Vincent Carpelli had seemingly vanished, leaving behind only a disconnected phone number and a forwarding address that led to a vacant lot. The discovery of Carpelli's disappearance sent shockwaves through the investigation. For the first time since Megan's vanishing, detectives had identified a concrete suspect who had fled rather than face questioning. However, their elation was short-lived when a more thorough investigation into Carpelli's background revealed connections that made several task force members deeply uncomfortable. Vincent Carpelli's brother-in-law was Detective Lieutenant Anthony Russo, Scranton Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division. Lieutenant Russo had been with the department for 12 years and had an exemplary record, including commendations for his work on several high-profile. When confronted about his family connection to a suspect in the Moore case, Russo appeared genuinely shocked and cooperative, immediately recusing himself from any involvement in the investigation and submitting to a voluntary polygraph examination. The polygraph results were inconclusive, not because Lieutenant Russo showed signs of deception, but because his emotional state made accurate readings impossible. However, a review of his case file and recent activities revealed several concerning patterns. In the 3 months leading up to Megan's disappearance, Russo had accessed the department's database to run background checks on 17 young women between the ages of 20 and 30, most of whom had no apparent connection to any of his acts. More troubling was the discovery that Lieutenant Russo had been present during the initial process of Megan's Honda Civic, despite the case being assigned to Detective Santos' unit. Security footage from the police garage showed Russo examining the vehicle for nearly 20 minutes while alone, though he had filed no report of his activities and had not documented any finding. Agent Reed's request to interview Lieutenant Russo was met with immediate resistance from the Scranton Police Department's administration. Captain William McKenna, a 30-year veteran who had hired Russo and considered him a protege, argued that federal involvement in internal affairs matters, violated departmental protocol, and could compromise ongoing investigation. The ensuing bureaucratic battle delayed any formal questioning of Russo for 3 weeks, during which time several pieces of potential evidence mysteriously disappeared from the department's evidence. On January 14, 2002, exactly 3 months after Megan Moore's disappearance, Lieutenant Anthony Russo was found dead in his home from an apparent suicide. A .38 caliber revolver was discovered in his right hand, and a note typed on his personal computer claimed responsibility for Megan's death, expressing remorse for his actions and providing the location of her remains in the abandoned quarry near Lake Wallenpaupack. The suicide note was both a breakthrough and a source of deep frustration for investigators. While it appeared to solve the case, forensic analysis raised immediate questions about its authenticity. The note contained factual errors about Megan's disappearance that a perpetrator would not have made, and the language patterns did not match samples of Russo's writing. Most damning was the discovery that the computer's timestamp showed the note had been created at 3:47 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the coroner estimated Russo's time of death. The search of the Lake Wallenpaupack quarry yielded nothing but confirmation that someone had wanted investigators focused on that location. The quarry showed signs of recent excavation activity. Tire tracks indicated that heavy machinery had been used to move large amounts of earth and rock. However, ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dog found no trace of human remains. The entire operation appeared to be an elaborate misdirection designed to waste time and resources while the real trail grew colder. Detective Santos realized she was dealing with something far more sophisticated than a simple abduction and murder. The manipulation of evidence, convenient death of a potential suspect, and the professional-grade misdirection all pointed to an organized operation with significant resources and inside knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Someone within the system was either directly involved or providing crucial information to those who were. The revelation that they were fighting an enemy with access to police procedures and evidence storage fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. Agent Reed made the decision to compartmentalize information, sharing crucial details only with a handful of trusted federal agents and excluding local law enforcement from sensitive aspects of the case. This decision would prove prescient when, 2 weeks after Russo's death, Detective Santos discovered that someone had accessed her case files during off hours using her login credential, access that should have been impossible since she was the only person who knew her password. By February 2002, The official investigation into Megan Moore's disappearance had reached an apparent dead end. The media had moved on to other stories, the task force had been disbanded, and pressure from the police department's administration had relegated the case to Detective Santos's growing pile of cold cases. However, Santos and Agent Reed continued their investigation through unofficial channels, meeting in secret, and sharing information through encrypted communication. Their clandestine efforts revealed a disturbing pattern. Database searches identified 12 other cases across Pennsylvania and neighboring states involving young women who had disappeared under similar circumstances over the past 5 years. In each case, vehicles had been found abandoned and cleaned, professional-grade product, personal belongings had been left behind, and one or more law enforcement officers connected to the investigation had either died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared shortly after. The scope of what they were uncovering was staggering. This was not the work of a single predator or even a small group of criminals. The evidence pointed to sophisticated criminal organization tentacle reaching deep to multiple law enforcement agencies, court systems, and government. The organization appeared to be trafficking young women, a scale that dwarfed anything federal authorities had previously encountered. As winter gave way to spring in 2002, Detective Santos found herself looking over her shoulder more frequently, changing her routes to work and sleeping with her service weapon within reach. She had received several anonymous phone calls suggesting she focus her attention on other cases, and her car had been broken into twice, despite being parked in supposedly secure locations. Agent Reed had been reassigned to a case in another state, though he continued to provide us through back. The message was clear. Some cases were meant to remain unsolved, and those who persisted in investigating them did so at their own peril. But Detective Santos had seen the pain in Robert and Janet Moore, had promised she would never stop looking for their daughter, and had sworn an oath to protect and serve. That meant more to her than her own safety. What she needed now was a break. One piece of evidence so compelling that it could not be buried. One witness so credible that they could not be silenced. One mistake by the criminals so significant that it would crack their carefully constructed wall of secrecy. That break would come, but not for another 18 years. Detective Maria Santos never truly let go of the Megan Moore case. Even as the years passed, the official investigation file gathered dust in the basement archives of the Scranton Police Department. She had been promoted to lieutenant in 2004, then to captain in 2009, but throughout her career advancement, she maintained a private case file that grew steadily thicker with newspaper clippings, follow-up reports, and meticulously documented connections between seemingly unrelated disappearances across the Northeast. The pattern had become unmistakable to those willing to see it. Between 1998 and 2010, 37 young women between the ages of 19 and 28 had vanished under nearly identical circumstances across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. All had disappeared from public places during evening or nighttime hours. All had their vehicles discovered abandoned but professionally cleaned. All had personal belongings that would normally accompany them anywhere. And in every single case, at least one law enforcement officer connected to the initial investigation had either died, disappeared, or been transferred to remote assignments within 18 months of the woman's vanishing. Santos had tried multiple times over the years to interest state and federal authority in the pattern, but her efforts were consistently thwarted by bureaucratic roadblocks, jurisdictional disputes, and what she increasingly suspected was deliberate obstruction. Files would go missing from secure office. Computer databases would experience technical difficulties whenever she attempted to run comprehensive searches. Promised meetings with federal task force coordinators would be canceled at the last minute due to scheduling conflict or budget constraint. The most frustrating aspect of her unofficial investigation was the wall of silence that surrounded any attempt to examine the law enforcement officer who had died or disappeared. When Lieutenant Anthony Russo died in 2002, his death had been ruled suicide, despite forensic evidence suggesting homicide. Since then, Santos had documented 14 other cases where police officers, sheriff's deputies, or state troopers connected to missing women investigations met untimely ends. Detective Ray Morrison, the Allentown Police Department, had died in a single-car accident in 2003, 3 weeks after requesting FBI assistance with a missing persons case that matched the pattern. Trooper Jennifer Walsh of the Pennsylvania State Police had vanished during a camping trip in 2005, shortly after filing a report that connected 4 disappearances across her patrol area. Detective Sergeant Carlos Mendez of the Reading Police Department had suffered a fatal heart attack in 2007 at age 34, despite having no prior medical conditions and being in excellent physical shape. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to connect the dot. Investigating these disappearances was hazardous to one's health. The message had been received by most law enforcement personnel who learned to classify such cases as runaways or voluntary disappearances, regardless of evidence to the contrary. The few officers who persisted often found themselves facing internal affairs investigation, transfers, undesirable assignments, or early retirement packages they couldn't refuse. Santos had survived longer than most because she had learned to be extremely careful about her activity. She never used official resources for her private investigation, never accessed police databases for information related to the missing women, and never discussed her theories with colleagues who might report her activities to superiors. Her investigation was conducted entirely on her own time, using public records, newspaper archives, and information obtained through retired officers who were beyond the reach of official retaliation. The breakthrough she had been waiting for finally came in March 2019, though it arrived in a form she never could have anticipated. Santos, now nearing retirement at 30 Scranton Police Department, received a phone call from FBI agent Jennifer Martinez of the Bureau's Organized Crime Task Force. Agent Martinez had been conducting an investigation into human trafficking operations along the eastern seaboard when she discovered a pattern that matched Santos's own research almost perfectly. "Captain Santos," Agent Martinez said during their first meeting in a diner out Scranton limits, "I've been reviewing cold cases involving missing women, and I keep finding references to your name in the file. I think we need to talk." Agent Martinez had arrived at her conclusions through a different route than Santos. The FBI's Human Trafficking Unit had been tracking financial transactions related to suspected trafficking operations when sophisticated computer analysis revealed patterns in seemingly legitimate businesses. Auto body shops, trucking companies, and construction firms across the Northeast showed unusual financial activity that suggested money laundering operations on a massive scale. When Martinez's team began investigating these businesses, they discovered that many were connected to missing persons cases. More significantly, they found evidence that the trafficking operation was protected by a network of corrupt law enforcement officers who provided advance warning of investigation, tampered with evidence, and eliminated threats to the organization's security. "This isn't just about missing women," Martinez explained during their clandestine meeting. "This is about a criminal organization that has systematically infiltrated law enforcement agencies across multiple states. They're not just trafficking, they're trafficking them with the active assistance of police officers, sheriff's deputies, and federal agents." The scope of what Martinez had uncovered was staggering. Financial analysis suggested that the traffic operation was generating between $50 and $75 million annually through the sale of young women to brothel, private collectors, and international buyers. The organization operated with military precision, using encrypted communications, sophisticated logistics networks, and violence when necessary to maintain. Most disturbing was the discovery that many of the missing women were not killed immediately after their abduction. Electronic surveillance had intercepted communications, suggesting that victims were held at various locations for months or even years, conditioned through psychological and physical abuse, and then sold to buyers who paid premium prices for trained merchants. The implications made Santos physically ill when she first grasped full horror of what had been happening. Martinez's investigation had identified 3 primary locations where victims were held during their conditioning period. One was a defunct military installation in rural Pennsylvania that had been purchased by a shell company in 2001. Another was a private compound in the Pocono that operated under the cover of a religious retreat center. The third was a network of safe houses scattered across urban areas, disguised as legitimate businesses such as massage parlors, private clubs, and residential treatment facilities. The federal task force had been preparing to move against the organization when they encountered the same obstacles that had frustrated Santos for years. Surveillance operations were compromised before they could gather actionable intelligence. Search warrants were delayed by administrative procedures until targets had time to relocate. Key witnesses disappeared or recanted their statements shortly before trial dates. We think they have people inside the U.S. Attorney's office fighted to every time we get close to something big, information leaks and our targets vanish. We need someone they don't know about, someone who has been working this from the outside. Santos agreed to share her 18 years of research with Martinez's task force, providing detailed files on each of the 37 disappearances she had documented. In return, Martinez promised to provide Santos with federal resources and protection as they prepared to make their move against the trafficking organization. The joint investigation revealed that Megan Moore's case was not just connected to the pattern, it was the key to understanding the entire operation structure. Forensic accounting showed that the trafficking organization had experienced a significant expansion in 2001 and 2002, suggesting that Megan's abduction had been part of a major recruitment drive. Phone records from Vincent Carpelli's auto body shop showed calls to numbers associated with known trafficking operations in New York and New Jersey during the weeks surrounding Megan's disappearance. Most significantly, financial records showed that Lieutenant Anthony Russo had received several large cash deposits in the months before his death, totaling nearly $75,000, far more than his police salary could account for. The deposits came from accounts controlled by the same shell companies that owned the suspected holding facilities. Russo had not been investigating the trafficking operation. He had been facilitating it. The realization that Russo had been working for the traffickers rather than investigating them forced Santos to reconsider everything she thought she knew about Megan's case. Russo had not been murdered to silence him. He had been eliminated because he had become a liability to the organization. His suicide note had been fabricated not to cover up the truth about Megan's disappearance, but to misdirect the investigation and protect the real perpetrator. Agent Martinez's team had identified the organization's leadership structure through years of surveillance and financial analysis. At the top was a man known only as the Coordinator, who managed operations across multiple states and maintained strict compartmentalization to prevent any single arrest from compromising the entire network. Below him were regional managers who oversaw specific geographical areas, and below them were local operatives who handled recruitment, transportation, and security. The organization had survived for over 2 decades by maintaining absolute discipline and eliminating any threats to its security. They had money, political connections, and a proven willingness to kill anyone who posed a danger to their operation. Taking them down would require perfect timing, overwhelming force, and operational security that exceeded their own. As 2019 drew to a close, Santos and Martinez worked to identify the organization's current leadership and locate their primary facility. They knew they would have only one chance to strike before the network disappeared and reestablish itself elsewhere. They also knew that many of the women who had been abducted over the years, including possibly Megan Moore, might still be alive and recoverable if they moved quickly enough. The final phase of their investigation would require resources and coordination beyond anything either woman had experienced in their careers. They would need the support of multiple federal agencies, cooperation from international law enforcement, and protection from the inevitable retaliation that would follow their action. But first, they needed to find someone inside the organization who could provide them with current intelligence about facilities, operations, and leadership. They needed someone who knew enough to bring down the entire network, but who had motivation to cooperate with law enforcement. That someone was about to present himself in the most unexpected way possible. The COVID-19 pandemic inadvertently provided FBI agent Martinez and Captain Santos with their first significant breakthrough in 20 years. As lockdown orders forced much of the country into isolation, the trafficking organization was compelled to modify their operational procedures in ways that created new vulnerabilities in their previously impenetrable security protocols. Agent Martinez's cybercrime specialists had been monitoring encrypted communication used by the organization since late 2019, but with limited success. The traffickers employed military-grade encryption and changed their communication methods frequently, making surveillance nearly impossible. However, the pandemic disrupted their established patterns and forced them to rely more heavily on digital communication to coordinate their operation. The first crack in their digital armor came in February 2020, when NSA analysts intercepted fragments of communications discussing the relocation of inventory due to health protocols. The language was coded, but context suggested that the organization was moving captive women from centralized facilities to smaller distributed locations to reduce the risk of detection during increased law enforcement, health, and safety inspection. Dr. Sarah Chen, a linguistic analysis FBI behavioral analysis unit, was assigned to study the intercepted communication patterns that might reveal details. Chen had spent 15 years analyzing communicable criminalizations and had developed sophisticated algorithms for detecting behavioral encoded language. They're using a substitution cipher based on restaurant terminology, Chen explained to Martinez during a secure video conference in March 2020. When they talk about menu items, they're referring to different categories of victims. Reservations are sales transactions. Kitchen staff appears to be their code for handlers and guards. The restaurant metaphor was particularly revealing because it provided insight into how the organization categorized their victims. Appetizers were young women held for short-term customers, typically kept for weeks or months before being sold. Main courses were victims intended for longer-term arrangements, often involving wealthy private buyers who wanted exclusive access to specific individuals. Desserts were victims designated for internationals, usually involving transportation to other countries. Most disturbing was the category they called specials, victims who were held indefinitely for the personal use of the organization's leadership or for special customers willing to pay premium. Based on the communication pattern, Chen estimated that the organization was holding between 150 and 200 women at any given time across their network of facilities. The breakthrough that changed everything came in June 2020, when a sophisticated cyber attack against the organization's financial infrastructure yielded a treasure trove of data. The attack was not conducted by law enforcement. It was the work of a rival criminal organization attempting to identify the trafficking network's money laundering operations for their own purposes. The attack failed to achieve its intended goal, but it did expose detailed financial records spanning the previous 5 years. FBI forensic accountants working with IRS criminal investigation discovered a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for the trafficking operation. One name that appeared repeatedly in the financial was Vincent Carpelli, the auto shop who had disappeared during the original investigation into Megan Moore. Far from being a peripheral figure, Carpelli appeared to be a significant player in the organization's logistics network. His auto shop had been one of several dozen businesses to launder money and provide cover for transportation. More importantly, the financial records revealed that Carpelli was still alive, still working with the organ. Electronic fund transfer showed regular payments to accounts controlled by someone using the identity Victor Carbone, a name that financial analysis revealed was an anagram of Vincent Carpelli. Carbone was operating a legitimate trucking company in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, just 40 miles from Scranton. Agent Martinez obtained surveillance authorization for Carbone's trucking operation in July 2020. The company, Northeast Logistics Solutions, operated a fleet of 23 trucks that delivered legitimate cargo throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. However, GPS tracking data revealed that several vehicles regularly made unexplained stops at locations that had no apparent business relationship with their declared cargo. One location that appeared frequently in the GPS data was a compound near Lake Wallenpaupack, the same area where Lieutenant Russo's fabricated suicide note had claimed Megan Moore's remains could be found. However, instead of the abandoned quarry that had searched 2002, the trucks were visiting a private facility that aerial surveillance revealed to be a heavily fortified compound with multiple buildings, guard tower, and sophisticated security systems. Property records showed that the compound had been purchased in 2003 by a religious organization called the Sacred Heart Retreat Center. However, financial analysis revealed that the retreat center was funded entirely through the same network of shell companies that supported the trafficking operation. The facility was not a religious retreat. It was one of the organization's primary holding and conditioning facilities. Surveillance of the compound began in August 2020 using a combination of aerial drones, long-range photography, and electronic monitoring. The facility operated with the precision of a military installation, with scheduled guard rotations, regular vehicle movements, sophisticated counter-surveillance measures that suggested the operators were well aware of law enforcement capabilities. The most valuable intelligence came from intercepted communications between the compound and Carbone's trucking operation. Phone calls and radio transmissions revealed details about scheduled deliveries and pickups that clearly referred to the movement of captive women. The communications also revealed that the organization was preparing for a major operational shift in response to law enforcement pressure. "They know we're getting close," Martinez, during a secure meeting in September 2020. The intercepted communications suggest they're planning to shut down the Lake Wallenpaupack facility and relocate their operation. "If we're going to move, it has to be soon." The decision to act was complicated by jurisdictional issues and the need for perfect coordination. The compound was located in a rural area where local law enforcement had limited resources and potentially compromised personnel. State police were reluctant to commit significant resources without guarantees of federal support. Federal agencies were constrained by legal requirements for evidence gathering and concerns about potential civil rights violations if the operation failed to produce actionable results. The breakthrough that finally enabled action came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen's linguistic analysis had identified a pattern in the organization's communication, suggested they were preparing to eliminate evidence and witnesses in advance of their relocation. References to clearing the kitchen and disposing of spoiled inventory indicated that the organization would murder the women they held rather than risk the conflict of moving the facility. The urgency of the situation forced federal authorities to authorize an immediate operation despite incomplete intelligence about the facility's layout and defenses. On October 15, 2020, a joint task force comprising FBI agents, ATF personnel, Pennsylvania State Police, and U.S. Marshals prepared to assault the Lake Wallenpaupack compound. The operation was scheduled for dawn on October 16th, when surveillance indicated that the facility's security would be at its lowest level due to shift changes. However, intelligence intercepts during the night of October 15th revealed that the organization had detected the law enforcement presence and was accelerating their timeline for eliminating evidence. At 3:17 a.m. on October 16, 2020, intercepted communications confirmed that the organization had begun kitchen cleaning operation. Emergency authorization was granted for an immediate assault on the compound, despite the tactical disadvantages of conducting the operation in darkness with incomplete preparation. The assault team approached the compound using night vision equipment and thermal imaging to navigate the heavily wooded terrain surrounding the facility. Aerial surveillance had identified 3 primary buildings within the compound, along with several smaller structures that appeared to be guard posts and utility buildings. What they discovered inside the compound would haunt the veterans of the assault team for the rest of their careers. The facility contained a sophisticated infrastructure for holding and conditioning captive women, including cells designed to house multiple individuals, medical facilities treating injuries, managing pregnancies, and training areas where victims were subjected to psychological and physical conditioning designed to break their resistance. The assault team was to prevent the kitchen cleaning up. The organization had murdered 43 women in the hours before the law enforcement assault, executing them with military efficiency and attempting to destroy the evidence through chemical dissolution. The facility's operators had escaped through underground tunnels that connected to evacuation routes in the surrounding forest. Among the bodies recovered from the compound was one that dental records would later identify as Megan Moore. She had survived in captivity for nearly 19 years before being murdered during the organization's final evacuation facility. The forensic evidence suggested that she had given birth to at least 2 children during her captivity, though no trace of the children was found. The discovery of Megan's remains finally provided the definitive proof that Santos and Martinez needed to confirm their theories about the scope and nature of the trafficking. However, cost of that confirmation devastating. 43 families would finally learn what had happened to their missing daughters, sisters, and wives, but they would also learn that their loved ones had endured nearly 2 decades of unimaginable suffering before their final violent death. The compound raid yielded extensive evidence about the organization's including detailed records of financial transactions, victim processing procedures, and communication protocols. However, the facility's operators had escaped, and the organization's leadership remained at large. The raid had dealt a significant blow to their operations, but it had not destroyed the network itself. What the investigators needed now was someone from inside the organization who could provide intelligence about the remaining facilities, identify the leadership structure, and help them prevent the murders of the women who were still being held at other locations. That source would present himself sooner than anyone expected, and his information would prove to be both more valuable and more horrifying than anything they had discovered so far. 3 weeks after the Lake Wallenpaupack compound raid, Vincent Carpelli made a decision that would either secure his freedom or guarantee his death. The organization he had served loyally for over 2 decades was systematically eliminating anyone who could connect the compromised facility, and Carpelli knew that his name appeared on too many documents and in too many communications to ensure his survival. Carpelli had joined the trafficking in 1999, initially as a simple money launderer who used his auto body's cash payment from various criminal. His role had expanded over the years, proved himself reliable and discreet, eventually becoming a key logistics coordinator responsible for transportation and facility management across the Pennsylvania operation. The transformation from small-time criminal to player in human trafficking had happened gradually, with each new responsibility carrying higher pay and greater risk. By 2020, Carpelli was earning over $400,000 annually through his work with the organization, but he was also responsible for operational details that could send him to prison for life if discovered by law enforcement. The Lake Wallenpaupack raid had shattered the organization's sense of invulnerability. For the first time in over 20 years, law enforcement had penetrated their security and captured significant evidence about their operation. The leadership's response was swift and brutal. Anyone who might become a liability was marked for elimination, regardless of their years of service or personal relationships within the organization. Carpelli learned of his precarious position through Antonio "Tony" Blessing, a longtime associate who managed security for the organization's New Jersey operation. Blessing and Carpelli had worked together for 15 years and had developed a personal friendship that transcended their. During a carefully arranged meeting in a truck stop near the Pennsylvania-New Jersey border, Blessing delivered a warning that potentially saved "They're cleaning house, Vinny," Blessing explained while maintaining careful surveillance around it. "Anyone who had direct contact with the lake facility is being retired permanently." Your name came up in the discussion. The organization's leadership had concluded that Carpelli's transportation operations had been compromised during the law enforcement investigation, making him a potential source of intelligence that could lead authorities to other facilities. The decision to eliminate him was purely practical. His death would remove a security risk and send a message to other organization members about the consequences of carelessness. Blessing's warning gave Carpelli a narrow window of opportunity to either flee the country or find protection through cooperation with law enforcement. Both options carried enormous risk. Fleeing would confirm his guilt and make him a permanent target for the organization's international reach. Cooperation with law enforcement might provide protection, but it would also require him to betray associates who would certainly attempt to kill him if they learned of his. The decision was made easier by Carpelli's growing revulsion at the organization's method. During his early years with the network, he had convinced himself that he was simply providing transportation and logistics support for what he assumed were adult women who had chosen to work in illegal but consensual sex trade. The reality of the organization's operations had been gradually revealed to time, but the full horror had only become clear during the final years before the Lake Wallenpaupack raid. In November 2020, Carpelli reached out to FBI agent Martinez through an intermediary who had experience negotiating cooperation agreements with federal prosecutors. The intermediary, attorney David Rothstein, specialized in representing organized crime figures who wished to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for protection and reduced sentence. Rothstein's initial contact with agent Martinez was carefully structured to protect Carpelli's identity while establishing his credibility source of valuable intelligence. The attorney provided specific details about the organization's financial arms that only an insider could know, including account numbers, transaction codes, and the local safe deposit box containing backup. My client has been involved with this organization for over 20 and federal prosecution. He has detailed knowledge of their operations, financial structure, and leadership hierarchy. However, he's also a marked man who needs immediate protection. He's going to cooperate with your investment. The negotiations for Carpelli's cooperation were complicated factors. First, federal prosecutors needed to determine the extent of his criminal culpability and whether his cooperation would justify immunity from prosecution for serious felonies, including human trafficking, money laundering, and accessory to murder. Second, the U.S. Marshals Service needed to assess the security risks involved in protecting a high-value witness from a sophisticated criminal organization with extensive resources and proven willingness to kill. Most challenging was the question of timing. Carpelli's information about active facilities and ongoing operations perishable. The organization was relocating operations and changing procedures in response to the Lake Wallenpaupack raid. Every day of negotiation potentially meant that critical intelligence would become obsolete and that additional victims would be murdered or moved beyond recovery. The breakthrough in negotiations came when Carpelli provided information that allowed federal agents to prevent an imminent mass murder. Through his logistics network, he had learned that the organization was planning to eliminate all witnesses held at a facility in upstate New York on December 15, 2020. The facility housed 37 women who had been held for periods ranging from 6 months to 12 years, and the organization had decided that relocating them carried unacceptable risk. Agent Martinez's team coordinated with the FBI's New York field office to conduct an emergency raid on the upstate facility on December 14, 2020. The operation was successful, resulting in the rescue of 37 women and the arrest of 14 organization members, including a regional manager who had been considered untouchable due to his political connect. The success of the upstate New York raid convinced federal prosecutors that Carpelli's cooperation was worth the legal and security risks involved. On December 18, 2020, Vincent Carpelli formally entered the Federal Witness Protection Program and began providing detailed testimony about his 21 years of involvement with the trafficking organization. Carpelli's debriefing sessions revealed the true scope and sophistication of the criminal network. The organization operated facilities in 11 states and maintained business relationships with similar networks in Canada, Mexico, and several Caribbean nations. Their annual revenue exceeded $200 million, generated through direct sales of victims, rental arrangements with customers, and ancillary services, including money laundering and document forgery. The organizational structure was more complex than investigators had realized. The network was divided into 5 regional operations, each managed independently to limit damage from law enforcement penetration. Communication between regions was minimal and conducted through encrypted channels changed frequent. Financial operations were handled through a separate division that maintained strict compartmentalization to prevent any single arrest from compromising the entire money laundering system. Most significantly, Carpelli revealed that the organization had corrupted law enforcement officials at every level, from local police departments to federal agents. The network of corrupt officials provided advance warning of investigation, tampered with evidence, and eliminated threats to the organization's security. The corruption was maintained through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic placement of organization members within law enforcement agents. They don't just pay off cops, Carpelli did during one of his debriefings. They recruit people who are already inside the system. They look for officers with financial problems, personal issues, or career ambitions that can be exploited. Once someone is compromised, they're in for life. Carpelli's information about corrupted law enforcement officials was particularly valuable because it explained why so many investigations had failed over the years. The organization had been receiving advance warning of virtually every law enforcement against, allowing them to relocate operations, destroy evidence, and eliminate witnesses before raids could be conducted. The revelation that the corruption extended to federal agencies created significant challenges for Agent Martinez's task force. Traditional investigative methods could not be used because the organization had sources within the FBI, DEA, and U.S. Marshal Service who could compromise any operation. The task force, forced to develop new protocols for maintaining operational security, while preparing for the massive coordinated raids that would be necessary to destroy the entire network. Carpelli's most valuable contribution was his detailed knowledge of the organization's current facilities and leadership structure. He provided locations for 17 active sites across the eastern United States, along with detailed information about security measures, personnel assignments, and victim population at each facility. He also identified the organization's senior leadership, including the mysterious figure known as the Coordinator, who had managed the network for over 15 years. The Coordinator's real name was Richard Kellerman, a former military intelligence who had been discharged from the Army in 1998 following an investigation into his involvement with illegal weapons. Kellerman had used his military training sophisticatedly. He maintained direct control over all major decisions while remaining physically removed from day-to-day operations. According to Carpelli, Kellerman operated from a heavily fortified compound in rural Virginia that served as both his residence and the organization's command center. The compound was protected by former military personnel and equipped with advanced surveillance and communication equipment. Kellerman rarely left the facility and conducted most of his business through encrypted communication with trusted intermediaries. The information provided by Carpelli enabled Agent Martinez to plan the most ambitious, coordinated law enforcement operation in the history of human trafficking. The operation would require simultaneous raids on 17 facilities across 11 states, conducted at sufficient speed and surprise to prevent the organization destroying evidence or murdering witnesses. However, planning and executing such an operation would take months, during which the organization would continue their activity and potentially discover Carpelli's defense. The race was on to strike before the network could adapt to the compromise of their logistics coordinates, and the stakes could not have been higher. Hundreds of women were being held in conditions of unimaginable brutality, and any delay could result in their death. The secure conference room in the Philadelphia field office had become Vincent Carpelli's second home during the spring of 2021. For 4 months, he had spent 8 to 10 hours daily recounting his involvement in one of the largest human trafficking operations in American history. The debriefing process was exhausting and psychologically devastating, as Carpelli was forced to confront the full horror of his crimes while providing the detailed information necessary to dismantle the network build. Agent Martinez had established a careful protocol for the confession sessions, recognizing that Carpelli's cooperation was essential, but that his psychological state was fragile. The witness was haunted by guilt over his role in the suffering of hundreds of women, and he experienced frequent pain when discussing civic incidents, violence, and abuse. Rebecca Foster, a psychologist specializing in trauma therapy for law enforcement witnesses, worked closely with the investigation team to ensure that Carpelli remained functional while providing complete testimony. The confession sessions were recorded on multiple devices and transcribed in real time to ensure accuracy and completeness. Federal prosecutors would need every detail to support charges against the dozens of organization members who would be arrested during the coordinated raid. More importantly, Carpelli's testimony would be crucial for locating and rescuing the women who were still being held at active facilities. Carpelli's account of Megan Moore's abduction and captivity was particularly difficult for him to recount, both because of his direct involvement, because her case had become the catalyst for the entire investigation. The details he provided were devastating in their specificity and cruelty, revealing the methodical process by which the organization selected, captured, and conditioned their victims. Megan was what we called a special order, Carpelli during a session in April, his voice barely. The customer had very specific requirements: young, educated, physically attractive, and from a stable family background. She had to be someone who would be missed, because the customer enjoyed the psychological aspect of knowing that people were searching for her. The customer who had requested Megan's abduction was identified by Carpelli as Marcus Beaumont, a wealthy businessman who operated a private investment firm in Manhattan. Beaumont had been a regular customer of the organization since 1997, purchasing women for his private collection and paying premium prices for victims who met his specific criteria. He maintained a private facility in the Adirondack Mountains. He kept several women for his use, often periods of years before disposing of. Beaumont's order for Megan had been placed in September 2001, accompanied by a payment of $200, an enormous sum that reflected both his wealth and the specificity requirement. The organization's intelligence network had identified several potential targets in the Scranton area, but Megan had been selected because her routine was predictable and her social life provided opportunity for abduction without immediate witness. The planning for Megan's begun 3 weeks before her disappearance. Carpelli's role in the operation was to provide and to ensure that evidence was properly cleaned and disposed of after. He had modified a panel van specifically for the operation, installing soundproofing, restraint systems, and specialized ventilation to prevent victims from suffocating during transport. We watched her for 2 weeks, Carpelli continued, his hands shaking as he recalled the detail. Tony Blessing and Mickey Torino were the ones who actually took her. They knew her routine, when she went to O'Malley's, where she parked, what time she usually left. They waited until she was alone in the parking. Abduction executed with military precision. Anthony Blessing approached Megan from behind and fumbled with her keys, using a stun gun to incapacitate her before she could scream or run. Mickey Torino assisted in loading her into the waiting van while maintaining surveillance for potential witnesses. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds from initial contact to departure. Carpelli had been responsible for cleaning Megan's vehicle and disposing of any evidence that might have been left at scene. He used professional-grade cleaning compounds to eliminate fingerprints, DNA evidence, and trace materials that could connect the organization to the abduction. The keys were scattered on the ground to suggest that Megan had dropped them during a struggle, while her purse and cell phone were left in locations that would be discovered by investigators but would provide no useful evidence. The cleaning was crucial, Carpelli explained. We had to make it look like something had happened, but we couldn't leave anything that would point to us. The car had to be clean enough to pass forensic examination, but not so clean that it was obviously tampered with. After the abduction, Megan had been transported to a processing facility in eastern Pennsylvania where new victims underwent initial conditioning. The facility, located in a converted warehouse outside Reading, was designed to break the psychological resistance of captives through a combination of isolation, sensory deprivation, and carefully calibrated physical and psychological abuse. Carpelli's description of the conditioning process was harrowing in its systematic cruelty. Victims were kept in soundproof cells with no natural light, fed irregular meals of poor quality, and subjected to random schedules that prevented them from establishing any sense of routine or control. They were given numbers instead of names and were punished severely for any reference to their previous lives or identity. The psychological conditioning was more important than the physical, Carpelli, his voice hollow. They needed to break the women's sense of identity and hope before they could be safely moved to customer facilities. The process usually took 3 to 6 months, depending on the individual's resistance level. Megan had been classified as a high-resistance subject due to her education, strong family connections, and previous stability. Her conditioning had been more intensive and prolonged than typical, lasting nearly 8 months before she was deemed ready for transfer to Beaumont's facility. During this period, she had been subjected to psychological techniques designed to create dependency on her captors and eliminate any hope of rescue or escape. The transfer to Beaumont's Adirondack facility had occurred in June 2002, approximately 8 months after her abduction. Carpelli had personally supervised the transportation using a specially modified recreational vehicle that appeared to be a family on vacation, while actually serving as a secure transport for human traffic. Beaumont's Place Fortress, Carpelli. It was built into the side of a mountain with multiple levels underground. He had security systems better than most military installations. The women he kept there, some of them had been with him for years. Megan had spent the next 18 years of her life in Beaumont's facility, along with 5 other women who had been purchased from the trafficking organization. Beaumont maintained detailed records of his captives, documenting their conditioning progress, medical status, and behavioral modification. These records would later prove invaluable for identifying other victims and understanding the full scope of the organization's operation. The conditions at Beaumont's facility were designed to maintain the women in a state of complete dependency while providing their captor with various forms of entertainment and satisfaction. The women were housed in individual cells, but were allowed to interact with each other during supervised periods. They were provided with books, television, and other diversions, but only as rewards for compliance with Beaumont's demand. He treated them like pets, Carpelli, struggling to maintain his. He had rules, routines, punishments, and reward. The women who had been there longest, they had adapted to survive. They knew how to avoid punishment and how to earn small privileges. According to Carpelli's account, Megan had given birth to 3 children during her captivity, 2 daughters and a son. Beaumont had forced her into pregnancy as part of his psychological control system, using her maternal instincts to ensure her compliance. The children were raised within the facility until they reached school age, at which point they were removed and placed in specialist boarding schools that catered to the children of wealthy criminals. The revelation Megan had children during captivity added another layer of urgency. The children, now teenagers, were potentially still alive and recoverable if investigators could locate the boarding schools where they had been placed. However, Carpelli's knowledge of the children's placement was limited, as that information was handled by a different division of the organization. Megan's death in October 2020 had been ordered not by the trafficking organization, but by Marcus Beaumont himself, who had decided to eliminate all evidence of his activities in response to the increased law enforcement pressure following the Lake Wallenpaupack raid. Beaumont had murdered all 6 women at his facility, then disposed of their bodies at the lake compound before fleeing to a prepared safe house in South America. He panicked, Carpelli explained. The raid at Lake Wallenpaupack meant that law enforcement was getting close to the organization's operation. Beaumont knew that if he was connected to the network, everything would come out. He decided it was easier to eliminate the evidence and start over. The discovery that Beaumont had murdered Megan and the other women at his facility just hours before they might have been rescued was devastating for the investigation. However, Carpelli's information about Beaumont's escape provided crucial intelligence for international law enforcement efforts to locate and extradite him. Carpelli's confession also revealed the extent of law enforcement corruption that had protected the organization for over 2 decades. He provided names, date, and specific details about payment made to police officers, federal agents, prosecutors, and judges who had assisted the trafficking network. The corruption extended to the highest levels of several law enforcement agencies and included individuals who were still in positions of authority. Lieutenant Russo was just one of many, Carpelli said when discussing corrupt officers. The organization had people in every major police department in Pennsylvania, plus contacts in the FBI, DEA, and U.S. Marshal. They paid well, and they made sure that anyone who took money couldn't back out. The information about corrupted law enforcement officials created significant challenges for planning the coordinated raids that would be necessary to destroy the organization. Agent Martinez's task force had to develop new operational security protocols and limit information sharing to prevent advance warning of their. As the confession sessions continued through the spring of 2021, Carpelli's deteriorating psychological state became increasingly evident. The weight of his crimes and the detailed recounting of violence and suffering had taken a severe toll on his mental health. Dr. Foster warned that he was approaching a logical breaking point that could render him unable to continue providing. The challenge for Agent Martinez was to obtain all necessary information while maintaining his psychological stability long enough to support the organization. The coordinated raids were scheduled for late June 2021, and Carpelli's testimony would be crucial for ensuring successful prosecution and maximum sentence for those arrested. The confession sessions had provided law enforcement with the most comprehensive intelligence about a human trafficking organization ever obtained. However, the true test of that intelligence would come during the raids themselves, when hundreds of federal agents would attempt to simultaneously destroy a criminal network that had operated successfully for over 2 decades. Operation Broken Chain launched at 4:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on June 23, 2021, with coordinated raids across 11 states from Maine to Florida. Agent Martinez had spent 3 months planning the operation with military precision, knowing that any delay or coordination failure could result in the murder of dozens of victims and the escape of key organizations. The scale of it was unprecedented in the history of federal law enforcement. Over 800 agents from the FBI, ATF, DEA, and U.S. Marshal Service participated in simultaneous raids on 17 facilities, supported by state and local law enforcement agencies that had been carefully vetted to prevent information. Each raid team was equipped with tactical gear appropriate for military operations, including armored vehicles, breaching equipment, and specialized medical personnel trained to treat traumatized victims. Captain Santos, now officially retired from the Scranton Police Department, but retained as a consultant for the operation, accompanied the raid team targeting the primary command facility in Virginia, where Richard Kellerman, the coordinator, was believed to be located. After 20 years of investigating Megan Moore's disappearance, she was determined to be present. The organization's leadership was finally brought to justice. The Virginia compound proved to be even more heavily fortified than Carpelli's intelligence had suggested. The facility was built into a hillside with multiple underground levels, sophisticated surveillance systems, and defensive positions that would have been appropriate for a military installation. The raid team encountered immediate resistance from security personnel armed with automatic weapons and wearing body armor that suggested military or paramilitary training. The assault on the compound lasted 4 hours and resulted in a running gun battle that extended through the facility's underground tunnels. When the shooting finally ended, 7 security personnel were dead, 12 others were wounded and in custody, and the raid team had secured the most comprehensive intelligence cache about human trafficking operations ever recovered by law enforcement. However, Richard Kellerman was not found at the facility. Electronic surveillance equipment showed that he had received advance warning of the raids and had evacuated the compound approximately 2 hours before the assault began. The warning had come from a source within the federal task force itself, confirming Carpelli's assertions about the extent of corruption within law enforcement agencies. Despite Kellerman's escape, the raids were remarkably successful. 14 of the 17 targeted facilities were successfully raided, resulting in the rescue of 127 women and children who had been held in various stages of captivity. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 34 and had been held for periods ranging 3 weeks to over 15 years. Many required immediate medical attention for injuries, malnutrition, and psychological. The evidence recovered from the facilities painted a horrifying picture of the organization's operation. Detailed records documented the abduction, conditioning, and sale of over 400 women during the previous decade alone. Financial records revealed revenues exceeding $300 million annually, generated through victim sales, rental arrangements, and ancillary criminal activities, including drug trafficking and money laundering. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of a comprehensive database containing the identities and locations of corrupt law enforcement officials who had assisted the organization. The database included photographs, payment records, and detailed information about specific services provided by corrupt. The information implicated personnel from local police departments to senior federal officials, creating the largest law enforcement corruption scandal in America. Agent Martinez found herself in the unprecedented position of investigating colleagues within her own agency while managing the prosecution of the trafficking organization's member. The FBI's Internal Affairs Division was overwhelmed. Scope, corruption revealed in the seized record, and several ongoing federal cases had to be reviewed to determine whether they had been compromised. Among the most shocking revelations was evidence that Detective Lieutenant Anthony Russo, whose apparent suicide in 2002 had been used to misdirect the original investigation, had actually been murdered by the organization when he became a liability. The database contained detailed records of Russo's payments from the organization, along with surveillance reports documenting his activities and a final entry noting his termination due to security concerns. The evidence proved that Russo had been providing the organization with advance warning of police investigation, tampering with evidence, and identifying potential victims who fit customer specifications. His murder had been disguised as suicide to prevent investigation and to provide a convenient scapegoat for Megan Moore's disappearance. A fabricated suicide note had been created by the organization's specialist in document forgery and evidence manipulation. The discovery of Russo's true role in the organization was devastating for Captain Santos, who had spent years believing that he might have been an innocent victim of the trafficking network. The realization that he had been an active participant in the crimes, including potentially providing information that led to Megan's abduction, forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the evidence recovered from the facilities also provided crucial information about the fate of victims who had been reported missing over the previous 2 decades. DNA analysis of remains found at several locations confirmed the identities of 37 women who had been reported missing from across the eastern United States. The discoveries provided closure for families who had waited years for information about their loved ones, but the closure came with the devastating knowledge of what their daughters and sisters had endured. Among the most significant discoveries was a facility in upstate New York that served as a breeding operation where women were forced to bear children who were then sold to wealthy individuals who wanted to purchase infants without going through legal adoption procedure. The facility contained detailed medical records documenting forced pregnancies, births, and child placements spanning over 15 years. The breeding operation revealed another horrifying dimension of the organization's activity. Children born to captive women were considered valuable commodity, particularly if they were born to victims who had been selected for their physical attractiveness and intelligence. The organization maintained detailed genetic records and used selective breeding practices to produce children who would command higher prices from customers. Vincent Carpelli's information about this aspect of the organization had been incomplete, as the breeding operations were managed by a separate division with strict compartmentalization. The discovery of the facility and its records provided investigators with leads to pursue the recovery of dozens of children who had been sold to customers across the United States and internationally. The investigation into the children sold by the organization became a separate federal task force led by the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit. The complexity of the cases was staggering, as many of the children had been sold to customers who had created false identity and legal documentation to support their claims of legitimate adoption or guardianship. As the summer of 2021 progressed, the full scope of the organization's criminal activities continued to expand. Financial analysis revealed connections to international trafficking networks operating in Europe, Asia, and South America. The organization had not been an isolated American criminal enterprise, but rather a significant component of a global network that generated billions of dollars annually through human trafficking, organ harvesting, and related criminal activity. The international connections created additional challenges for prosecution efforts, as many of the organization's senior members had fled to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Richard Kellerman was believed to be in South America, where he was reportedly attempting to establish new operations using contacts developed during his 2 decades of trafficking. The evidence of international connections also attracted federal agents responsible for security, as investigators discovered that the organization was selling intelligence information to foreign governments. The trafficking network had been in a unique position to gather sensitive information through their contacts within law enforcement agencies, and they had monetized this information by selling it to hostile intelligence service. By September 2021, federal prosecutors had filed charges against 247 individuals connected to the trafficking organization, including 23 current or former law enforcement. The charges ranged from human trafficking and racketeering to murder and conspiracy, with many defendants facing potential life sentences without parole. The prosecution efforts were coordinated through the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, where Agent Martinez's investigation had been based. The legal proceedings were complicated. The need to protect the identities of victims who would serve as witnesses. The challenges of prosecuting cases spanned multiple decades, and the security concerns created by the large number of defendants who faced sentence. Several defendants attempted to negotiate operation agreements similar, but their information was generally less valuable than what had already been obtained. Vincent Carpelli's cooperation had proven to be the key to dismantling the entire organization. His detailed knowledge of operations, personnel, and procedures had enabled law enforcement to strike at the network's core before it could adapt to the loss of individual facilities or personnel. However, his cooperation had also made him a permanent target for retaliation from organization members who remained at large. The success of Operation Broken Chain was tempered by the knowledge that dozens of organization members had escaped, and that the international connections meant that similar networks continued to operate in other regions. The investigation struck a devastating blow against human trafficking in the eastern United States, but it had also revealed the global scope of a problem that extended far beyond any single criminal organization. For Captain Santos, the successful completion of the investigation brought a measure of closure to her 20-year quest for justice in Megan Moore's case. However, the knowledge of what Megan had endured during her captivity and the discovery that she had been murdered just hours before law enforcement might have rescued her created a bittersweet conclusion to the longest investigation of her career. The real test of the operation's success would come during the trial phase, when prosecutors would need to present overwhelming evidence of the organization's crimes while protecting the victims who had survived to testify against the captor. The trials would also provide a public accounting of how such a massive criminal enterprise had operated for decades, detection, and how corruption within law enforcement agencies had enabled the trafficking network to flourish. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia became the epicenter of the largest human trafficking prosecution in American history, as the trials of Operation Broken Chain defendants began in October 2021. U.S. District Judge Patricia Morrison, a 25-year veteran of the federal bench known for her meticulous handling of complex criminal cases, was assigned to oversee the proceedings that would determine the fate of 247 defendants charged with crimes ranging from human trafficking to murder. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, faced the monumental challenge of presenting evidence spanning over 2 decades while protecting the identities and psychological well-being of surviving victims who would serve as witness. Chen had previously prosecuted international organized crime cases, but the scope and complexity of the trafficking organization's crimes dwarfed anything in his experience. The defense attorneys, many of them high-profile criminal lawyers, retained by defendants with significant financial resources, pursued a strategy of challenging the credibility of Vincent Carpelli's testimony while arguing that their clients were peripheral figures who had been coerced into participation by the organization's leadership. The strategy was complicated by the overwhelming documentary evidence recovered during the raids, which included detailed records of each defendant's role in the trafficking operation. Agent Martinez served as the prosecution's primary case agent, coordinating testimony from hundreds of law enforcement personnel who had participated in the investigation and raid. Her 20-year career with the FBI had prepared her for complex cases, but the emotional toll of presenting evidence about the suffering of trafficking victims tested even her considerable experience and resilience. Captain Santos was called as a witness during the second week of proceedings to testify about the original investigation into Megan Moore's disappearance and the pattern of evidence tampering that had protected the organization for decades. Her testimony was particularly compelling because it demonstrated how the trafficking network had successfully manipulated law enforcement investigation from the very beginning of their operation. The first major revelation during the trials came when prosecutors presented evidence that the organization had been planning to expand their operations significantly in response to increasing demand from international. Documents recovered from the Virginia Command Facility showed plans to establish new conditioning facilities in the southwestern United States and to develop supply chains that would funnel victims from Central and South America to customers in Asia and Europe. Vincent Carpelli's testimony began on October 18, 2020, under extraordinary security measures that included armed U.S. Marshal, bulletproof glass, and electronic jamming equipment to prevent remote detonation of explosive devices. Carpelli had lost significant weight during his months in protective custody, and his psychological condition remained fragile despite ongoing therapy with Dr. Foster. The testimony was devastating in its detail and scope. Over the course of 6 days, Carpelli methodically described his involvement in the trafficking organization, providing specific information, dozens of abductions, the conditioning procedures used to break victims' resistance, and the financial operations that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Carpelli's account of Megan Moore's abduction and subsequent captivity particularly harrowing for the courtroom observers, including members of the Moore family who had waited 20 years for answers about their daughter's fate. His description of the systematic psychological physical abuse inflicted on trafficking victims left several jurors visibly shaken and required frequent breaks to allow emotional recovery. I want the court to understand that I'm not trying to minimize my role in these crimes. Carpelli died during cross-examination. Defense attorneys, I participated in the suffering of hundreds of women over more than 20 years. I know that my cooperation doesn't erase what I did, but I hope it can help prevent other women from experiencing what these victims endured. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit Carpelli were largely unsuccessful due to the extensive documentary evidence that corroborates account. Financial records, communication intercepts, and physical evidence for raided facilities all supported the details about the organization and his role within the net. One of the most dramatic moments proceedings came. Dr. Rebecca Foster testified about the psychological conditioning techniques used by the trafficking organization to control their victim. Dr. Foster had interviewed over 60 surviving victims during the preparation of trial, and her testimony provided the court with scientific context for understanding how seemingly intelligent and capable women could be rendered completely dependent on their captor. The conditioning process was designed to systematically destroy the victim's sense of identity, autonomy, and hope, Dr. Foster explained to the court. Through carefully calibrated psychological manipulation, physical deprivation, and intermittent reinforcement, the organization created learned helplessness that made escape seem impossible, even when opportunities might have existed. The testimony of surviving victims was the most powerful evidence presented during the trials, though many women were unable to testify due to the severe psychological trauma they had experienced. Those who were able to take the stand provided heartbreaking accounts of their abduction, captivity, and the systematic abuse they had endured. Sarah Michelle Watson, who had been held by the organization for 7 years, abducted college campus in Maryland, testified about the conditioning process and the psychological techniques used to maintain control over victims. Her testimony was delivered via closed-circuit television to protect her identity, but her words carried devastating impact as described years of systematic dehumanization. They took away everything that made me who I was. My name, my memories, my hope for the future. They replaced it all with fear and dependency. Even after I was rescued, it took months of therapy before I could remember that I had been a college student with dreams and plans for my life. The financial evidence presented during the trials revealed the staggering scope of the organization's operation. Forensic accountants testified that the trafficking network had generated over $2 billion in revenue during the 15 years for which complete records were available. The money had been laundered through a complex network of legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency transactions that had taken months to unravel. The corruption evidence was equally shocking in its scope and detail. Prosecutors presented records showing that the organization had paid over $50 million in bribes to law enforcement during the previous decade. The payments had purchased advance warning of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and the elimination of office threats. Detective Lieutenant Anthony Russo was posthumously identified 400 from the organization in 19. The evidence showed that he had provided the trafficker with advance warning of the investigation into Megan Moore's disappearance and had actively worked to misdirect the inquiry away from the organization's operation. The revelation about Russo's corruption was particularly difficult for Captain Santos, who had worked closely with him during her early career and had considered him a mentor. The evidence showed that Russo had not only been protecting the trafficking organization, but had also been identifying potential victims who matched customer specifications, including possibly providing information that led to Megan Moore's selection for abduction. As the trials progressed through November and December 2021, the defense strategy shifted from challenging the evidence to arguing for reduced sentences based on cooperation claims of coercion. Several defendants provided additional information about the organization's operations in exchange for plea agreements, though none possessed the comprehensive knowledge that had made Carpelli's cooperation so valuable. The international connection revealed during the investigation created diplomatic complications. Prosecutors sought to extradite organization members who had fled to other countries. Several nations, including some traditional allied states, were reluctant to cooperate due to concerns about their own citizens who might be implicated in the trafficking network. Marcus Beaumont, the wealthy businessman, purchased Megan Moore and held her captive for 18 years, remained a fugitive in South America despite intensive effort by international law enforcement. Intelligence reports suggested that he was attempting to establish new operations in countries with weak law enforcement and high levels of government corruption. The trials also revealed the extent to which the organization had infiltrated legitimate businesses to support their operation. Auto body shops, trucking companies, construction firms, and even medical facilities had been used to launder money, transport victims, and provide cover for trafficking activity. Many of these businesses had been operated by individuals who claimed to be unaware of their connection to the trafficking network, though financial records suggested otherwise. By December 2021, the first wave of defendants had been convicted on various charges related to their participation in the traffic. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life imprisonment without parole, depending on the defendant's role in the organization and level of cooperation with prosecutors. The convictions sent a clear message that human trafficking would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. However, the successful prosecution of the organization's members could not undo the suffering that had been inflicted on hundreds of victims over more than 2 decades. The trials provided a measure of justice for the women who had been trafficked, but they also highlighted the limitations of the criminal justice in addressing crimes of such massive scope and duration. The Moore family attended many of the trial proceedings, seeking closure and justice for their daughter's death. Robert Moore, now in his 70s and using a walker due to health problems related to stress his daughter's appearance, testified during the sentencing phase about the impact of Megan's abduction on his family. "We lost our daughter twice," Moore court's victim impacts. "First when she was taken from us, and again when we learned what she had endured during all those years. We hoped and prayed for her safe return. These trials can't bring Megan back, but they can ensure that the people responsible for her suffering are held accountable for their crime." The trials continued into 2022 as prosecutors worked through the massive number of defendants and the complex web of charges related to the trafficking organization operation. The proceedings represented not just the prosecution of individual criminals, but a comprehensive examination of how such a massive criminal enterprise had been able to operate for decades while corrupting law enforcement agencies and exploiting hundreds of victims. The reverberations from Operation Broken Chain extended far beyond the Philadelphia courthouse. The trafficking defendants faced justice. The exposure of massive corruption within law enforcement agencies triggered congressional investigations, internal affairs reviews, and a fundamental reassessment. Federal agencies monitored and prevented corruption within their ranks. FBI Director Christopher Morrison announced the formation of a special internal affairs task to investigate the 43 current and former Bureau personnel who had been implicated in the trafficking organization's corruption. The task force, led by Assistant Director Laura Stevens, was granted unprecedented authority to examine personnel files, financial records, and operational decisions spanning the previous 2 decades. The investigation revealed systematic failures in the FBI's internal monitoring systems that had allowed corrupt agents to operate undetected for years. The trafficking organization had specifically targeted agents with financial difficulty, personal problems, or career ambitions that could be exploited through bribery, blackmail, or promises of advancement. Once compromised, agents were gradually drawn deeper into the corruption network through incremental requests. The most shocking discovery was that the corruption had reached the supervisory level within several FBI field offices. Special agent in charge, Robert Kellerman of the Pittsburgh field office, no relation to the trafficking organization's leader, Richard Kellerman, had been receiving payments from the network since 2005 in exchange for providing advance warning of federal investigations and ensuring certain cases received low priority or were compromised. Agent Kellerman's corruption had been particularly damaging because his position allowed him to influence the assignment of major cases and the allocation of investigative resources. Several human trafficking investigations had been deliberately sabotaged or misdirected under his guidance. Dozens of victims their lives and allowing the criminal organization to span their operation. The revelation that corruption existed at special agent in charge level sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and prompted calls for congressional oversight of federal law enforcement agents. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, announced comprehensive hearings to examine how such extensive corruption had gone undetected and what reforms were necessary to prevent similar failure. Agent Martinez found herself thrust into the spotlight as congressional witnesses sought to understand how the trafficking investigation had succeeded despite the extensive corruption within law enforcement agencies. Her testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee provided a rare insider's perspective on the challenges of investigating major criminal organizations when the investigators themselves could not be trusted. The corruption was so extensive that we had to assume any traditional law enforcement channel could be compromised. Martinez of the committee. We developed new protocols for information sharing, used federal agents from outside the affected regions, and relied heavily on technological surveillance methods that couldn't be easily compromised by human sources. The congressional hearings revealed that similar corruption networks had been operating within other federal agencies, including the DEA, ATF, and U.S. Marshals Service. The trafficking organization had invested heavily in corrupting law enforcement officials because they understood that protection from investigation was essential to their long-term survival and growth. Captain Santos, despite her retirement from active law enforcement, was called to testify about the challenges of investigating trafficking cases at the local level when corruption existed within police departments. Her 20-year struggle to pursue the Megan Moore investigation provided committee members with a case study in how corruption could undermine even the most dedicated investigative effort. The organization didn't just buy individual office, they bought protection at every level of the system. When I tried to pursue leads pointed toward the traffic network, I encountered obstacles that seemed like bureaucratic incompetence but were actually deliberate obstruction. The hearings also examined the international implication of the trafficking organization operation. Intelligence agencies testified that the corruption network had been providing sensitive law enforcement information to foreign governments, potentially compromising national security operations and endangering intelligence assets overseas. The scope of the damage became clear when counterintelligence specialists revealed that several major international investigations had been compromised by information leaked through the corruption network. Drug trafficking cases, terrorism investigation, and financial crime prosecution had all been affected by the organization's access to law enforcement. While the congressional investigation continued, the prosecution trafficking organization entered it. By February 2022, over 200 defendants had been convicted on various charges, sentences ranging from 15 years imprisonment without parole. The severity of the sentence reflected both the heinous nature of the crimes and the federal sentencing guidelines for human trafficking. Vincent Carpelli's cooperation agreement resulted in a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, significantly less he would have. The sentence was controversial among victim advocacy groups, who argued that his role in facilitating decades of trafficking deserved more severe punishment, but prosecutors defended the agreement as necessary to secure his cooperation. Mr. Carpelli's information was essential to dismantling this organization and rescuing over 100 victims who might otherwise have remained in captivity indefinitely, explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen during Carpelli's sentencing hearing. While his crimes were heinous, his cooperation has saved lives and brought justice to hundreds of victims. The most significant breakthrough in the international aspect of the case came in March 2022, when Brazilian authorities arrested Richard Kellerman, the organization's leader, at a compound near Sao Paulo. Kellerman had been living under an assumed identity and was reportedly attempting to establish new trafficking operations in South America when he was captured. Kellerman's extradition to the United States required extensive diplomatic negotiations, as Brazilian law prohibited the extradition of individuals who might face the death penalty. Federal prosecutors were forced to provide guarantees that Kellerman would not be subject to capital punishment in exchange for Brazilian cooperation in his extradition. The arrest of Kellerman provided investigators with access to additional intelligence about the organization's international connections and remaining operation. During his initial questioning, Kellerman revealed that the network had been much larger than previously understood, with operational cells in over 20 countries and revenues exceeding $2 billion annually. Marcus Beaumont, the businessman who had purchased and murdered Megan Moore, remained a fugitive despite intensive international efforts to locate him. Intelligence reports suggested that he had fled South America for Southeast Asia, where he was believed to be living under a new identity and potentially attempting to purchase victims from local trafficking networks. The search for Beaumont became a priority for international law enforcement agents, not only because of his role in Megan's murder, but also because his extensive customer network represented a significant ongoing threat to potential victims. Financial analysis suggested that Beaumont had spent over $5 million purchasing women from trafficking organizations during the previous 15 years, making him one of the most prolific customers in the global market. As the prosecution phase of Operation Broken Chain drew to a close in the summer of 2022, federal agencies began implementing reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. New monitoring systems were established to track agent financial activities, communication patterns, and case assignments that might indicate potential compromise. The reforms included mandatory polygraph examinations for agents assigned to major criminal investigations, enhanced background checks that included financial monitoring, and new protocols for information sharing that limited access to sensitive intelligence based on operational necessity rather than administrative convenience. However, law enforcement experts warned that determined criminal organizations would adapt to the new security measures just as they had adapted to previous reforms. The trafficking investigation had revealed that corruption was not simply a matter of individual moral failure, but a systematic vulnerability that sophisticated criminal organizations would continue to exploit. The human cost of the trafficking organization's operations continued to unfold as victim services specialists worked to provide support for the women and children who had been rescued during the raid. Many victims required extensive medical treatment for injuries, malnutrition, and sexually transmitted diseases contracted during their captivity. The psychological treatment of trafficking victims proved to be even more challenging than their physical rehabilitation. Dr. Foster and her team of specialists worked to develop new therapeutic approaches for individuals who had experienced years or decades of systematic abuse and conditioning, designed to break their psychological resistance. These women have survived experiences that would destroy trafficking victims. Their recovery requires not just healing from trauma, but rebuilding fundamental concepts of identity, autonomy, and self-worth that were systematically destroyed during their captivity. The children born to trafficking victims presented unique challenges for social services agencies tasked with their care. Many of these children had never experienced life outside of captivity and required specialized education and therapeutic support to develop normal social skills and emotional regulation. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the cases of children who had been sold by the trafficking organization to customers who raised them their own. Legal proceedings to reunite these children with their biological mothers when possible, or to place them in appropriate foster care, required careful navigation of complex legal and emotional issues. By August 2022, the immediate prosecutorial phase of Operation Broken Chain had concluded with the conviction of 247 defendants and the implementation of new security protocols designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. However, investigators knew that their work was far from complete. The international scope of human trafficking meant that other organizations would attempt to fill the void left by the dismantled network. The success of Operation Broken Chain had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated through persistent investigation, innovative techniques, and the courage of individuals willing to risk their lives to seek justice. However, it had also revealed the enormous challenges facing law enforcement agencies in combating crimes that span decades across international borders and corrupt the very institutions responsible for preventing them. For the families of trafficking victims, the conclusion of the prosecutions brought a measure of closure, but could not erase the years of suffering their loved ones had endured. The Moore family's 20-year wait for answers about Megan's disappearance had ended with confirmation of their worst fears, but also with the knowledge that her case had been instrumental in bringing justice to hundreds of other victims. 1 year after the conclusion of the major trial, the full impact of Operation Broken Chain continued to reverberate through law enforcement agents, victim advocacy organizations, and the families forever changed by the trafficking network's crime. The Philadelphia courthouse had become quiet again, but the reforms and investigations triggered by the case continued to transform how federal agencies approached organized crime and internal corruption. Agent Jennifer Martinez now promoted to assistant special agent in charge of the FBI's human trafficking, oversaw the ongoing efforts to locate and remaining members of the organization who had escaped during the initial raid. Her team had identified 47 individuals who remained fugitive, including several mid-level managers who possessed detailed knowledge of the organization's international manhunt for these fugitives had yielded mixed results. European law enforcement agencies had arrested 12 organization members attempting to establish new operations in Eastern Europe, while authorities in Asia had captured 6 individuals who were working to rebuild trafficking networks in Southeast Asia. However, the most dangerous fugitives, including Marcus Beaumont and several regional managers, remained at large. Richard Kellerman's extradition to the United States in June 2022 had provided investigators with unprecedented insight into the global scope of human trafficking operations. During months of interrogation, Kellerman revealed that the dismantled organization had been part of a larger international network that included similar ops in Europe, Asia, and South America. What we uncovered in Pennsylvania was just one branch of a much larger tree, Martinez explained during a briefing for international law enforcement. The financial analysis suggests that there are at least 6 other major trafficking organizations operating with similar scope and sophistication in different regions of the world. Kellerman's cooperation with federal authorities was motivated by his desire to avoid the death penalty and potentially secure a transfer to a federal facility with better conditions than the Supermax prison where he was being held. His information had led to the identification of trafficking operations in 12 other countries, though prosecuting these cases required complex international legal cooperation that could take years to complete. The discovery of the international network's scope had prompted the creation of a new multinational task force coordinated through Interpol and funded by contributions from affected countries. The task force represented the most ambitious international law enforcement cooperation effort since the creation of counterterrorism initiatives following September 11th and 1. Captain Maria Santos, now serving as a consultant to victim advocacy organizations, had dedicated her retirement to ensuring that the lessons learned from the Megan Moore investigation were incorporated into training programs for law enforcement officers nationwide. Her experience had demonstrated the importance of persistence in cold case investigation and the need for officers to recognize patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. Santos had also become an advocate for police reform measures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had protected the trafficking organization for decades. She testified before state legislatures considering new oversight mechanisms for police departments and helped develop training programs to teach officers how to recognize signs of corruption within their own agency. The corruption wasn't just about individual officer money, Santos explained during a training supervisor. It was about a systematic failure to maintain accountability and oversight. We need to create systems that make it impossible for criminal organizations to operate with impunity. For decades, the reforms implemented in response to Operation Broken Chain had extended beyond law enforcement to include changes in how federal agencies monitored and investigated potential corruption. New technologies were deployed to analyze communication patterns, financial transactions, and case assignments for signs of compromised person. However, the implementation of these reforms had created new challenges for legitimate law enforcement operation. The increased oversight and monitoring requirements had slowed some investigations and created administrative burdens that strained already limited resources. Some veteran agents complained that the new procedures made it more difficult to develop the kind of long-term relationships with informants that were essential for major criminal investigations. The psychological and social rehabilitation of trafficking victims continued to present enormous challenges for victim services organizations. Dr. Rebecca Foster had established a special treatments for trafficking survivors that served as a model for similar facilities being developed at the country. The center provided comprehensive medical care, psychological therapy, and life skills training designed to help victims rebuild their lives after years or decade activity. Recovery from this kind of trauma is not just about healing from individual incident abuse. Foster explained during a conference on trafficking victim rehabilitation, these women have to rebuild fundamental concepts of identity, relationships, and hope that were systematically destroyed over years of conditioning. It's like teaching someone to be human again. The center had treated over 200 trafficking survivors since its establishment, with varying degrees of success depending on the duration of their captivity, the severity of abuse they experienced, and their individual psychological resilience. Some women had been able to rebuild relatively normal lives, employment, establishing relationships, and even reuniting with family members. Others were severely damaged and required long-term institutions. Perhaps the most challenging cases involved the children born to trafficking victims during their captivity. These children, now ranging in age from toddlers to young adults, had never experienced normal family relationships or social interactions. Many required specialized education and therapy to develop basic social skills and emotional regulation ability. The legal battles over custody of these children had created complex ethical and legal questions courts were still struggling to resolve. Some biological mothers who had been rescued wanted to establish relationships with children they had been forced to bear in captivity, while others preferred that the children remain with foster families who had provided them with stability and normal childhood experience. The financial impact of the trafficking organization's crimes continued to unfold as forensic accountants traced the disposition of the network's assets. The $1.2 billion in revenue that prosecutors had documented represented only the traceable portion of the organization's finance. Investigators estimated that the total revenue over the organization's 23-year operation likely exceeded $3 billion. Efforts to recover these assets for victim compensation had been partially successful, with federal authorities seizing approximately $400 million in bank accounts, real estate, and other assets connected to the trafficking organization. However, much of the money had been transferred to offshore or converted to untraceable assets like cryptocurrency, precious metals, and art. The Victim Compensation Fund, established with the recovered assets, provided some financial support for trafficking survivors, but the amounts were modest compared to the scale of suffering the women had endured. Most survivors received between $50,000 and $100,000, depending on the duration of their captivity and the severity of abuse. For many survivors, the financial compensation was less important than the acknowledgement of their suffering and the knowledge that their captors had been brought to justice. However, the practical challenges of rebuilding lives after years or decades in captivity required ongoing financial support that exceeded what the compensation fund could provide. The Moore family had established a foundation in Megan's memory that provided support for trafficking survivors and funded research into more effective treatment methods for trauma victims. Robert Moore, now 74 and in declining health, had made the foundation the primary focus of his remaining years, determined to ensure that his daughter's death would contribute to preventing similar tragedy. Megan can't be brought back, but her story can help save other women who are still trapped in these horrible situations, Robert explained during the Foundation's first annual fundraising. If her suffering can prevent even one other family from going through what we've experienced, then her death will have some meaning. The Foundation had funded the establishment of 3 additional treatment centers for trafficked survivors and had provided scholarships for women who wanted to pursue education or job training after their rescue. The Foundation also supported research into new therapeutic approaches for trauma victims and advocacy efforts to strengthen laws against human trafficking. Janet Moore, Megan's mother, had found purpose in working directly with trafficking survivors at Dr. Foster's Treatment Center. Her experience of waiting 20 years for news about her daughters had given her unique insight into the psychological challenges faced by women trying to reconnect with family they had been forced. I understand what it's like to live with hope and despair at the same time, Janet Moore told a group of newly rescued trafficking victims during a support group. I know how hard it is to imagine that your life can ever be normal again, but I also know that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. The international efforts to combat human trafficking had been strengthened by the intelligence gathered during Operation Broken Chain, but law enforcement officials acknowledged that they were engaged in an ongoing battle against criminal organizations that continued to adapt and evolve. New trafficking networks had already emerged to fill some of the void left by the dismantled organization, using different methods and targeting different populations of potential victims. The success of Operation Broken Chain had also created unintended consequences in the global trafficking market. The disruption of the established organization had led to increased competition among remaining trafficking networks, resulting in more violence and more aggressive recruitment methods. Some law enforcement experts worried that the destruction of one large organized network had led to the proliferation of smaller, more violent organizations that were harder to detect and infiltrate. Technology had become both a tool for combating trafficking and a new vulnerability criminal organizations exploit. Advanced encryptions made it more difficult for law enforcement to monitor criminal communication, while the growth of cryptocurrency and digital payments provided new methods for laundering money and conducting transactions without traditional banking oversight. However, the same technological advances also provided new opportunities for law enforcement to detect traffic. Artificial intelligence systems were being developed to analyze vast databases of missing persons reports, looking for patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. Facial recognition technology was being used to identify victims and suspects in images found on the internet or recovered from criminal organizations. The legal framework for prosecuting human trafficking cases had been strengthened by legislation passed in response to Operation Broken Chain. New federal law increased penalty trafficking offenses, expanded the definition of trafficking to include additional forms of exploitation, and provided additional resources for victim service and law enforcement. State governments had also responded with legislation designed to improve coordination between local and federal authorities and to provide better training for police officers in recognizing signs of traffic activity. However, implementing these new laws and training programs required resources that many jurisdictions struggled to provide. As 2024 approached, Agent Martinez and her team continued their work to locate remaining fugitives from the trafficking organization, while also investigating new networks emerged in the aftermath. The work was frustrating and dangerous, but Martinez was sustained by the knowledge that their efforts had already saved hundreds of lives and brought justice to victims who had suffered for decades. The investigation had also changed Martinez personally, forcing her to confront the extent of human cruelty while also witnessing the extraordinary resilience trafficking survivors had rebuilt their lives after unimaginable suffering. The experience had strengthened her commitment to law enforcement while also teaching her about the limitation of criminal justice in addressing crimes of such scope. Captain Santos, now in her mid-60s, continued her advocacy work while also serving as a mentor to younger investigators working on trafficking cases. Her 20-year struggle to solve the Megan Moore case had become a cautionary tale about the importance of persistent cold cases, but also a testament to the eventual triumph of justice over organized crime. The investigation taught me that no case is ever really closed until all the questions are answered, Santos reflected during an interview on the 20th anniversary of Megan's disappearance. It also taught me that criminal organizations are only as strong as the corruption that protects them. When you remove that protection, even the most sophisticated criminals can be brought to justice. The shadow cast by the trafficking organization would continue to affect the lives of survivors, families, and law enforcement officials for years to come. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of law enforcement institutions to corruption and the ease with which criminal organizations could exploit those vulnerabilities. However, Operation Broken Chain had also demonstrated that persistent investigation, innovative techniques, and international cooperation could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The success of the operation had provided a template for future investigation, while also revealing the enormous challenges that remained in combating global crime. For the families of trafficking victims, the conclusion of the prosecutions had provided answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. The knowledge that their loved ones had been found and their killers brought to justice offered some measure of closure, even though it could not erase the years of suffering that had preceded their death. The story of Megan Moore's disappearance and the investigation that ultimately brought her killers to justice had become more than just a criminal case. It had become a symbol of the importance of never giving up hope, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It had also become a reminder justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through the dedication of individuals willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. As investigators continued their work to locate remaining fugitives and prevent new trafficking route, they carried with them the memory of the hundreds of women who had suffered at the hands of the dismantled organization. The investigation had ended, but the fight against human trafficking continued, sustained by the knowledge that every rescue, every prosecution, and every conviction represented a victory for justice and hope over cruelty and despair. The fingerprint that had finally exposed the shocking truth about Megan Moore's disappearance had opened a window into a world of unimaginable horror, but it had also illuminated the path toward justice for hundreds of victims who had waited decades for someone to hear their silent screams for help. In the end, the truth had prevailed, and though it came too late for Megan and many others, it had ensured that their suffering would not be, and that their deaths saved the lives of countless others who might have